Every letter you are reading right now exists because a civilization was destroyed. Not one civilization. All of them. Every major kingdom, every great empire, every interconnected palace economy that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Nile Delta to the mountains of central Anatolia, from the shores of Crete to the river valleys of Mesopotamia. In the span of roughly 50 years, between 1200 and 1150 BC, they all fell. The Hittites, who had rivaled Egypt for 2 centuries, vanished so completely that for 3,000 years no one even remembered they had existed. The Mycenaean Greeks, who built the fortress of Mycenae and sailed to Troy, collapsed into a dark age so total that they forgot how to write. The great trading city of Ugarit, one of the wealthiest ports in the ancient world, was burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Its last king wrote a letter begging for help. The letter was never sent. Archaeologists found it, centuries later, still in the kiln, still being baked into clay when the fires came. On the walls of an Egyptian temple in a place called Medinet Habu, the pharaoh Ramesses III carved a record of what happened. He described a wave of attackers arriving by land and by sea, a confederation of peoples whose names we can read, but whose identities we cannot confirm. The Egyptians called them by many names: Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Modern historians call them collectively the Sea Peoples. And here is the mystery that has haunted archaeologists for over a century. We do not know who they were. We do not know where they came from. We do not know if they were the cause of the collapse, or its consequence, or merely one symptom among many. What we do know is that the world before them and the world after them were so different that they might as well have belonged to separate planets. And everything you take for granted today, your alphabet, your access to iron, the very idea that ordinary people can govern themselves, emerged not from the age of bronze, but from its ashes. This is the story of how the ancient world ended, and how, from the wreckage, ours began. To understand the catastrophe, you must first understand what was lost. And to understand what was lost, you must travel back to a world that in many ways resembled our own far more closely than most people realize. By the 14th century, BC dawn, the Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was a system, a web of interdependent civilizations connected by trade routes, diplomatic marriages, shared technologies, and constant correspondence. Historians sometimes call it the first globalization, and the comparison is not an exaggeration. At the center of this system stood Egypt, ruled during its peak by pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties, names that still echo through time: Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Ramesses II. Egypt controlled the Nile Valley, parts of Nubia to the south, and a string of vassal states along the Levantine coast, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and western Syria. Its wealth was almost incomprehensible. The tomb of a single pharaoh, Tutankhamun, a minor king who died young and accomplished little, contained over 5,000 objects of gold, lapis lazuli, alabaster, and ebony. If this was how they buried a teenager of modest reign, imagine what the tombs of the great pharaohs must have held before the grave robbers came. To the north and east of Egypt lay the Hittite Empire, based in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. Their capital, Hattusa, sat on a rocky plateau near the modern village of Bogaskoy, surrounded by massive walls with gates flanked by carved stone lions and sphinxes. The Hittites were the first civilization to master ironworking on any meaningful scale, though they kept the technology a closely guarded secret. Their empire, at its height, stretched from the Aegean coast to the upper reaches of the Euphrates, encompassing roughly 260,000 square miles, an area comparable to the state of Texas. To the west, across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks controlled a network of heavily fortified palace complexes scattered across mainland Greece and the islands. Mycenae itself, which Homer would later call rich in gold, sat on a hilltop in the Argolid plain, its famous Lion Gate welcoming visitors through walls so massive that later Greeks believed only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, could have built them. Each stone in those walls weighs several tons. The largest weigh over 100 tons, moved and placed without iron tools, without pulleys as we know them, without any power source beyond human muscle, wooden levers, and extraordinary determination. Between these great powers lay a constellation of smaller but vital kingdoms. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast near modern Latakia, was a trading hub whose merchants dealt in copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Egypt, and textiles from across the Aegean. The city was home to perhaps 8,000 people, modest by modern standards, but enormous for the 13th century BC. Its scribes wrote in at least 7 languages and invented one of the world's earliest alphabets, a system of 30 cuneiform signs that represented individual sounds rather than whole words or syllables. This was a revolution in technology as profound as the printing press, though it would take centuries, and the destruction of the very world that created it before the alphabet spread to the wider Mediterranean. Cyprus, the copper island, which the ancients called Alatia, supplied the raw material that gave the age its name. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Without copper, there is no bronze. Without bronze, there are no weapons, no tools, no chariot fittings, no monumental sculptures. Cyprus was, in a very real sense, the oil field of the Bronze Age world, and then there was the tin. Copper was abundant, tin was not. The nearest major sources of tin lay thousands of miles from the eastern Mediterranean, in Afghanistan, in Cornwall, at the far western edge of Britain, possibly in parts of Central Asia. To acquire tin, Bronze Age merchants maintained trade networks of extraordinary length and complexity. Networks that passed through multiple kingdoms required dozens of intermediary traders and depended on the stability of every link in the chain. If any single link broke, if any single kingdom along the route fell into civil war or closed its borders, the tin stopped flowing. And when the tin stopped flowing, no one could make bronze. This was the hidden fragility beneath the golden surface. The Bronze Age world was prosperous precisely because it was interconnected, but it was vulnerable precisely because it was interconnected. Every kingdom depended on every other kingdom. Every trade route depended on every other trade route. The system worked beautifully when every part functioned, but it had almost no resilience when multiple parts failed at once. We know in extraordinary detail how this system operated because the kings wrote to each other constantly. In 1887, a peasant woman digging in the ruins of Amarna in Middle Egypt stumbled upon a cache of clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age. These were the Amarna letters, the royal correspondence of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, dating to roughly 1350 BC. There are 382 surviving tablets, and they reveal a world of startling sophistication. Kings addressed each other as brother. They negotiated marriages between their children. They complained, with remarkable pettiness, about the quality of gold sent as diplomatic gifts. The king of Babylon wrote to the pharaoh protesting that the gold statues Egypt had sent were not solid gold but merely gold-plated, and that this was an insult to his dignity. The pharaoh of Egypt wrote to the king of Arzawa asking for a physician to be sent, because Egyptian doctors could not cure a particular illness. The king of Al-Ashir apologized for a delay in copper shipments, blaming a plague that had struck his island. Reading these letters is like reading emails between heads of state. The concerns are diplomatic, commercial, personal, and sometimes trivially human. These were not alien beings living in an incomprehensible past. They were people running complex states, managing supply chains, negotiating alliances, and worrying about the same things leaders worry about today. The difference is that their world was about to end, and not one of them saw it coming. The system reached its symbolic peak around 1274 BC, when Ramesses II of Egypt and Muwatalli II of the Hittite Empire clashed at the Battle of Kadesh, near the Orontes River in modern Syria. It was the largest chariot battle in recorded history. Egypt brought roughly 20 Ugarit soldiers and 2,000 chariots. The Hittites fielded a comparable force, perhaps larger. The battle itself was indecisive, though Ramesses spent the rest of his life carving exaggerated accounts of his personal bravery on every available temple wall. But what followed the battle was more remarkable than the battle itself. After years of continued skirmishing, the two empires signed a peace treaty, the earliest surviving peace treaty between two major powers in human history. A copy was inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphs on the walls of the Karnak temple. Another copy, in Akkadian cuneiform, was found in the Hittite archives at Hattusa. The two versions match in substance, though each side, predictably, claims to have been the one that generously offered peace. A replica of this treaty hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a reminder that the impulse toward negotiated peace is not modern. It is more than 3,000 years old. This was the Bronze Age at its zenith. Two superpowers, strong enough to devastate each other, choosing diplomacy instead. Trade flowing across thousands of miles of sea and land. Cities growing, temples rising, scribes recording, merchants prospering. It must have seemed, to anyone living within the system, as though it would last forever. It did not last another century. The collapse, when it came, did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived as a cascade. Modern archaeologists, particularly Eric Klein, whose 2014 book framed the collapse for a wide audience, have compared it to a perfect storm, multiple independent catastrophes striking the same interconnected system within the same narrow window of time, each one amplifying the others. The first stress was environmental. Pollen core samples from lakes in the eastern Mediterranean, from the Sea of Galilee, from lakes in central Anatolia, and from sediment cores in Cyprus, all tell the same story. Beginning around 1250 BC, the region entered a prolonged period of drought. Rainfall declined sharply. Rivers shrank. Harvests failed. This was not a single bad year. This was a multi-generational shift in climate, possibly lasting 150 years or more, driven by changes in atmospheric circulation patterns that climatologists are still working to fully understand. For societies that depended on agriculture, this was devastating. For societies that depended on agriculture and on the stability of their neighbors, it was existential. Hungry populations do not wait patiently for rain. They migrate, they rebel, they raid. The second stress was seismic. The eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most geologically active zones on the planet, where the African, Arabian, and Anatolian tectonic plates converge. Archaeological evidence shows that a series of powerful earthquakes struck the region between roughly 1225 and 1175 BC. The destruction layers at Mycenae, Tiryns, Medea, and other Mycenaean sites show signs consistent with earthquake damage. Walls toppled in specific patterns, buildings collapsed in ways that fire alone does not explain. The city of Ugarit also shows earthquake damage in its final destruction layer. A single earthquake can be rebuilt from. A series of earthquakes, striking a region already weakened by drought and political instability, is a different proposition entirely. The third stress was internal. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were centralized to a degree that made them powerful, but also brittle. The king controlled the distribution of resources, The scribes tracked every jar of oil, every sheaf of grain, every ingot of copper. The system worked when the palace was strong and the harvests were good. When the harvests failed, when the palace could no longer distribute, the social contract broke. There is evidence from multiple sites, from the Hittite homeland, from the Mycenaean world, from parts of the Levant, of internal revolts, of populations turning against their own ruling elites. The palaces did not only fall to external enemies, some of them fell to their own people. And then, into this already fracturing world, came the Sea Peoples. They appear in Egyptian records spanning roughly a century, from the reign of Merneptah in the 1200s BC to the reign of Ramesses III in the 1170s. They are described as a confederation, not a single people but an alliance of groups. The names the Egyptians gave them, Peliset, Tjeka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Luka, Weshesh, have been debated endlessly by scholars. The Peliset are almost certainly the Philistines, who settled on the southern coast of what is now Israel and gave their name to Palestine. The Luka may be Lycians from southwestern Anatolia. The Shekelesh may be Sicilians or Sardinians, or neither. The Danaan may be connected to the Homeric Danaians, one of the names Homer gave to the Greeks. Some of these identifications are probable, others are little more than educated guesses. The truth is that we do not know, and we may never know, exactly who all of the Sea Peoples were. What we do know is what they did. Around 1200 BC, the Sea Peoples swept through the eastern Mediterranean in what the Egyptian records describe as a coordinated campaign of destruction. They did not simply raid coastal towns and leave. They moved with their families. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show ox carts carrying women and children alongside the warriors. This was not a raiding party. This was a migration. An entire population, or populations, on the move, burning as they went. Ugarit was among the first to fall. The city's last king, a man named Amurapi, wrote a letter to the king of Alashia, modern Cyprus, that survives to this day. In it, he describes the situation with a desperation that transcends 32 centuries. "My father," he wrote, "the enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities and have done great damage in the country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of the Hittites, and all my ships are in the land of Lycia? The country is abandoned to itself. Let my father know that 7 enemy ships have already arrived and done great damage. If more enemy ships arrive, let me know somehow so I can decide what to do." The letter was found in the ruins. It was never sent. Ugarit was destroyed around 1185 BC and never occupied again. Today, its ruins lie near the modern Syrian town of Ras Shamra, silent under the Mediterranean sun. Hattusa, the great Hittite capital, was destroyed around the same time, possibly a few years earlier. The destruction was catastrophic. The city was burned so thoroughly that the fire vitrified the mud brick walls, turning them to glass in places. The royal archives survived only because clay tablets, unlike papyrus or wood, are hardened by fire rather than destroyed by it. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, is known to us primarily from a few inscriptions describing naval battles off the coast of Cyprus. He appears to have been fighting desperately on multiple fronts. And then, silence. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for over 4 centuries, which had fought Egypt to a standstill, which had negotiated the world's first peace treaty, simply ceased to exist. No final surrender. No exile. No last stand recorded for posterity. The king vanished. The empire vanished. The very memory of the Hittites vanished so completely that by the time of classical Greece, no one knew they had ever lived. The Mycenaean world collapsed in stages. The great palace at Pylos was destroyed by fire around 1180 BC. The palace at Thebes burned. Mycenae itself was destroyed and partially rebuilt, then destroyed again. Tyrants survived in diminished form. Within a generation, the Mycenaean writing system, Linear B, a syllabic script used to record inventories, tribute lists, and palace administration, fell out of use. Greece entered a period historians call the Greek Dark Ages, lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 B. C. During this period, population declined sharply. Long-distance trade virtually ceased. Monumental architecture stopped. Writing disappeared entirely for at least 2 centuries. It was, by any measure, a civilizational collapse as severe as any in human history. The only great power to survive was Egypt, and it survived only barely. In approximately 1178 BC, Ramesses III met the Sea Peoples in 2 battles, one on land, somewhere along the Levantine coast, and one at sea, in the Nile Delta itself. The sea battle is depicted in extraordinary detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu near modern Luxor. The reliefs show Egyptian warships engaging the Sea People's vessels at close range. Egyptian archers fire from the decks. Enemy warriors tumble into the water. The Egyptian ships appear to have used grappling hooks to draw the enemy vessels close, negating the Sea People's advantage in open water maneuvering. Ramesses claimed total victory. The enemy, he inscribed, were capsized and overwhelmed. They were dragged, overturned, and laid low upon the beach, slain and made into heaps from stern to bow of their galleys. Egypt survived. But it was never the same. The cost of the war, combined with drought, crop failures, and the severing of international trade networks, weakened the new kingdom irreversibly. Within a century of Ramesses III's victory, Egypt had fragmented into rival power centers. The great age of the pharaohs was over. Stand now in the aftermath and look at what remains. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant, the palace economies are gone. The great kings are gone. The trade networks are shattered. The tin roots are broken. Bronze can no longer be produced in the quantities needed to sustain the old way of life. And here is where destruction becomes creation. Without tin, without bronze, people turned to a metal that had been known for centuries but never widely adopted because it was difficult to work. Iron. Unlike tin, iron ore is abundant nearly everywhere. You do not need a trade network spanning 3 continents to acquire it. You can dig it from your own hillside. Iron democratized warfare, agriculture, and tool-making in a way that bronze never could. A Bronze Age king controlled his army because he controlled the supply of bronze. An Iron Age farmer could forge his own plough. The transition from bronze to iron was not merely technological, it was political. It redistributed power downward, from palaces to people. Without the palace scribes and their complex cuneiform systems, a simpler writing technology spread across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, inheritors of the coastal Levantine tradition that had produced the Ugaritic alphabet, refined and simplified the system into 22 consonantal signs. This Phoenician alphabet traveled with Phoenician merchants to every port in the Mediterranean. The Greeks adopted it around the 9th century BC and added vowels, creating the ancestor of every European alphabet in use today. The Latin letters you are reading at this moment descend in a direct, unbroken line from those Phoenician signs, which descend from the traditions of a world that was burned to the ground 32 centuries ago. Without the centralized palace kingdoms, new forms of political organization emerged. The Greek city-state, the polis, was born in the vacuum left by the Mycenaean collapse. Without a king distributing resources from a palace, communities had to govern themselves. The long, painful, experimental path from aristocratic rule to the democratic assembly of classical Athens began in the rubble of the Bronze Age. Democracy did not emerge from strength. It emerged from loss. The Philistines, likely descended from the Peliset among the Sea Peoples, settled on the southern coast of Canaan in cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. They brought with them Aegean pottery styles, dietary habits, and architectural traditions. They became, in time, the enemies of the biblical Israelites, their name preserved forever in the story of David and Goliath. An entire people, once part of the most mysterious migration in ancient history, reduced in cultural memory to the villain in a shepherd boy's story. The Hittites were forgotten so thoroughly that when 19th century archaeologists first found references to them in Egyptian and Assyrian texts, scholars doubted they had ever existed as a major power. It was not until 1906, when Hugo Winkler excavated Hattusa and discovered the royal archives, 10,000 clay tablets in Akkadian and Hittite, that the world learned an empire of 250,000 square miles had simply been erased from human memory for 3,000 years. The Hittite language, once decoded, turned out to be the oldest known Indo-European language, a distant ancestor of the linguistic family that includes English, Spanish, Hindi, and Russian. They had been hiding in plain sight, inside the very words we speak. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated events in ancient history. Was it caused by the Sea Peoples, by climate change, by earthquakes, by internal revolt, by the fragility of interconnected systems? The honest answer is that it was almost certainly caused by all of these factors simultaneously, each one worsening the others in a feedback loop that no single kingdom could break. The system was not destroyed by one blow. It was destroyed by the convergence of many blows, arriving at the same moment against a system that had no capacity to absorb them all. There is a lesson in this that does not require much imagination to apply to the present. We live today in a world more interconnected than any since the Bronze Age, indeed, far more interconnected. Our supply chains span the globe. Our economies depend on the stability of distant nations. Our technologies require rare materials sourced from a handful of locations. Our climate is shifting in ways that are measurable and accelerating. The Bronze Age world did not collapse because its people were foolish or primitive. It collapsed because complexity and interdependence, the very qualities that made it powerful, also made it fragile. Resilience is not a gift that comes with prosperity. It is a discipline that must be built deliberately. And the Bronze Age kingdoms never built it. The Sea Peoples remain faceless. We have their names carved in Egyptian stone. We have images of their feathered helmets and their round shields frozen in the reliefs of Medinet Habu. We have the cities they burned and the silence they left behind. But we do not have their voices. They wrote nothing that survives. They left no archives, no poetry, no laws. They exist only in the records of the civilizations they helped to destroy, described always as the other, the enemy, the invader. Whatever stories they told about themselves, whatever reasons they had for leaving their homes and sailing into a burning world, those stories are lost. They are history's most consequential ghosts. And yet, consider this. Every time you write a word using the 26 letters of the modern alphabet, you are using a technology that exists because the Bronze Age world was shattered. Every time you pick up a steel tool, you are holding the descendant of a revolution that began when the tin roots broke and iron became the only option. Every time you vote, or argue in a public forum, or expect your government to answer to its citizens, you are living inside a political tradition that was born not in the grand palaces of the Bronze Age, but in the small, struggling communities that rebuilt from the wreckage after the palaces fell. The civilization that crashed the Bronze Age left no name for itself. It built no monuments. It authored no sacred texts. And yet it may have done more to shape the world you live in than any empire that came before it. The destroyers gave us the tools of creation. The nameless gave us the alphabet that lets us name everything. The forgotten made the world remember differently. Sometimes, the most important chapter in the story of civilization is the one where civilization ends. And sometimes, the most powerful legacy belongs not to the builders, but to the ones who, by burning the old world down, made it possible for a new one to be born. The letters you are reading right now exist because a civilization was destroyed. You did not choose that inheritance. Someone chose it for you, roughly 3,200 years ago in a world on fire at the edge of the sea.